Now we will be moving on to our 20-minute fireside chat titled Building for Billions, Decentralized Data for Mass Adoption. I would like to warmly welcome Evin McMullen, COO at Disco XYZ, and David Phelps from JokeDAO. Thank you for coming. Oh. Perfect. Works for me. All right. The floor is both of yours. No worries.
This on? I don't think these are on.
It's on. Oh, it's on-ish. On enough. You're gonna stand while I sit?
Absolutely. It's a power move. GM, everybody, how are we feeling? Caffeinated? Ready?
Can I shill you for a minute?
Immediately, yes. Why don't you shill me first, and then I'll shill you instead of us introducing ourselves.
Okay, let's do that. Way easier, because sometimes you gotta fake it a little bit, and now I don't, because I absolutely fucking love Evin. So I think a lot of you already probably know Evin if you haven't seen her incredible debate with Vitalik over the question of verifiable credentials versus non-transferable NFTs, aka soul-bound NFTs. Please go watch it. Totally incredible. Disco for me is one of the big game changers in the system today. We have been operating, I think, under a lot of principles over the past 10 years of objective, trustless authority, of immutable blockchain data systems that are totally public and transparent. Those have been incredible. They've served a lot of roles. There are a lot of other uses of data that I don't think I need to tell everyone in this room about that can be unlocked once we start allowing for other possibilities. So as a way of showing you, I'll show myself for a moment. I am co-founder of a governance protocol called JokeDAO, in which we allow communities to submit proposals and then vote on their favorites. And if you think about governance right now and how it's done, it's fully transparent, and it's very hard to really control for who's voting, right? You can try to do quadratic voting, but ultimately lots of parties can take their tokens and they can move that around to different addresses and they can obfuscate to scam the system. So verifiable credentials, which allow you to actually affirm who somebody is, what their contributions are this huge unlock on the surface for just being able to actually have some sort of civil disincentivization where you can have people voting. But it goes way further than that, because once you can start tracking people's contributions, what they've done, et cetera, you might actually change the voting power that they have as well. And so you can get into this kind of incredible flywheel where the governance itself is giving greater data about who contributes, who's voting, who has power, but in turn, that verifiable credential that people are creating is then giving greater power to the voting itself, because you can change how people are voting as well. And so you get this incredible flywheel between governance and verifiable credentials that I personally am just very excited by. To give one small example of why I fucking love Disco. So that's my quick shell.
Outstanding. I love this form of introduction. That was stellar. Thank you so much, David. So I am also very excited to be sharing a stage with you today. David is one of my favorite crypto think boys and investors, serial entrepreneur. Highly recommend that everybody follow him on Twitter at @divine_economy. But one of the interesting challenges and something that David invites me to think about a lot is how do we make the experience of governance and participation something that human beings want to do simply as an activity, not necessarily just as means to an end. So, for example, recently, JokeDAO's mechanism informed the way that the Rehash podcast decided who to have as guests on their upcoming season. And by very publicly making this sort of voting and participation process visible on Twitter, it created its own social flywheel. People who did not listen to the podcast were actively invested in the voting process of who would be in the next season. And it became a week-over-week battle to be able to see, who is being included, what kinds of support factions were, for driving particular individuals. Obviously, David ended up on top because he's got a whole cartel of people voting for him. I was also there. But I think, one of the themes that we're going to discuss today is, how can we prioritize the human experience of Web3. We are building human coordination tools, emphasis on the human. And so if we do not delight in our participation, what are we even doing here?
Okay, so that leads me to a question. How can we prioritize the human experience in Web3?
I think that's a great question, David.
Thank you.
So prioritizing the human experience, I think, starts off with the problems that we choose to solve. I think, all too often in Web3, we substitute emergence for proper research and planning, and we, rub a couple protocols together and see what sets on fire, which is cool. But if we start off instead by studying our fellow human beings, identifying the areas in which they experience friction, frustration, insufficient value, and then build tools to alleviate that friction, rather than emergently creating a product and then trying to find an audience and problem for it to solve. So, sort of further to that end, once we've identified a problem that is real to human beings, we start to think about how to remove that friction. The process by which we develop solutions can be inherently human. So at Disco, we practice what we call human-centered design, where we validate all of the features we include in our products against user needs. We engage with our users and test our beta version every single week. And we ensure that no feature ends up in our product unless it is explicitly addressing a user need. And so by centering the experience of your offering around the user, we can ensure that not only what we're providing is valuable, but we can also go a step further and ask our users, are you having fun? Does this experience suck for you? Are you tolerating this? Or is this actually something that you enjoy participating in? Is this something that makes sense to you? And so by continuously recentering our technical practice around the experience that it delivers, as opposed to just the novelty of its technical mechanisms, then we have a greater opportunity to build things that make the world suck less.
Is this also a use case for verifiable credentials in which you have better collection of individuals' data?
I think that just about every activity that does not require global public availability in perpetuity is a great use case to explore with verifiable credentials. So, we run through the world emitting all kinds of data exhaust from the activities that we do, whether it's walking through the doors here, pouring ourselves our 8th cup of coffee, buying things on the internet, shilling tokens on Twitter. All of these actions are creating an opportunity to be captured, but most of them do not have a capture mechanism. Most of them do not offer us a way to take custody of the data that describes our choices. And so the more instances in which we as individuals can capture our own data exhaust and carry it with us in an independently verifiable form, the greater the known universe of information about ourselves is that we can bring to applications, and the more personalized experiences we can have without relying on some intermediary that's eventually just going to sell that data so we'll buy more stuff on Instagram.
So this is something I've been thinking about a lot about recently, which is when you have public, transparent, immutable systems, you have this incentive mechanism to collect data, right? Because now not only are people releasing much more data that is public and that you can use, so you can vampire attack and airdrop to people based on their data preferences, but because they know they're going to get airdrops, they might be more incentivized to release that data, show that data, and have it collected in the first place because they are directly monetizing from it as well, right? So then I guess the question is, verifiable credentials in some ways are very much founded in the premise of privacy, sovereignty, et cetera. There this play into this public sphere? Is there? I guess another way of framing this is: are there times where you would say that data should not be a verifiable credential? It should be totally public, or it should not be controlled by the user. And is there a distinction, or should everything be a verifiable credential?
That's a great question. And I know that a lot of, so my, knee-jerk answer is everything should be a verifiable credential. But to your point, there are absolutely instances of accountability and availability that are not well suited for private data. So for example, the actions of our public elected officials, I think, should be globally available, persistent, in a form that can be understood by, all relevant and affected parties. Now, the schema of that data might be a verifiable credential, but where it lives, how it is publicized, I think should be far greater than the private by default, narrative that most of our VCs experience. I also think that generally, as our whole ecosystem moves forward, we will and should embrace signed data as the kind of the way forward. Now, the schema of that data, the structure of that data, need not always be a verifiable credential, but there seem very few few instances where emitting data in a form that is not signed by its author, that cannot be attributed back to the party that said it, is sort of us cutting ourselves off at the knees, like failing to use the very basic capabilities of public key cryptography that that underpin the reason that we all manage keys. That said, I also I wonder whether the interplay between Web 2 and Web 3 doesn't offer us an opportunity to capture data from Web 2, have it signed by the party that is holding it, that's handing it off to another, so that it can be more portable, be more sovereign in the ecosystem of Web 3. And what I mean by sovereignty, or sort of self-sovereignty, is that the subject of the data has the most control over it, but not ultimate control, because then everything is self-attested, can be modified, and we kind of break down this idea of trust in signatures.
Yeah, so I think this raises a question for me also of like, is a user a single person? A lot of data is jointly created, right? I mean, think about an issue that's plagued Web 2 is like whether or not to ever have reviews on dating sites, right? On the one hand, you could say this would be a great idea because you could really know who are like abusive figures to stay away from, right? But on the other hand, it's so subjective, and that it's just going to create a lot of paranoia, anxiety, et cetera, because it's almost like jointly created data between these two people, right? So who has control there, I guess, is one question. But the bigger one is, how do you define a user and who the user is when so much data is jointly created? Yeah,
shared secrets. Something that we have the ability to, to create, curate, and in some sense control in Web3. So to kind of jump back to your dating site example, right after I was an undergrad, there was briefly in the United States a startup called Lulus.com. And Lulus was like Yelp for men. Women were able to leave reviews on their dates to, rank them in accordance with a variety of different categories. Is he a mama's boy? Does he pay for dinner? Does he open the door, et cetera? And so this was, celebrated as a public good in some circles and decried as a great affront and centralized offense to others. So it was taken down a couple years in due to all kinds of defamation lawsuits. But the question remains, how do we handle negative reputation, or reputation that can be interpreted as negative in the context of a self-sovereign and self-curated experience? So I kind of think that we're sort of handling two separate problems here. One is, how do we as individuals curate our presentation of self so that it is, subject to our consent and appropriate for the environment? I'm sure that the way that we're interacting right now might be slightly different than the BDSM-themed one-inch party that we're going to go to later, and that is a function of our ability to exercise self-curation in different spaces. That said, like the sort of the funny interplay is that if we're leveraging verifiable credentials, and someone wants to attest to the fact that, like, I didn't do a great job on this panel, they want to give me a grade of a C instead of an A, I may not want to take custody of that credential and show it off to others when I go to the next event, next panel. And so I think we are moving toward a world in which the absence of positive reputation will be tantamount to negative reputation, and that no reputation at all will not necessarily be a negative thing, but will invite an eyebrow raise. So let's say I'm part of a DAO. I'm an active member of Boys Club. I contribute a lot. I contribute to the newsletter. I organize events. I'm receiving verifiable credentials that attest to all of my awesome contributions to my community. If I go to another DAO and I want to join that DAO, I can show my track record of participation on chain. I can show my track record of positive sort of receipts of a job well done off chain. Taken together, those things demonstrate that I'm a pretty good member of the community. Now, if I have a bunch of proofs on chain of the fact that I've been part of this community for a long time, and I have no endorsements from my fellow community members, no one is willing to stand up and vouch for the fact that I brought good vibes to the party, we now have a discussion. There's a question there. Why is it that you can prove your participation, but you cannot prove the quality of your contributions?
Yeah, that's kind of how Twitter works, because I think of Twitter as kind of the great governance platform where you have people upvoting all the time by giving a like to say, I not only want to curate this for my own feed, but I want to curate it for everyone else's feed as well, right? Like, I believe that this thing is so good that I am going to spend time tapping and clicking when I don't need to in order for others to see this content as well. And of course, the way Twitter works is that if no one is doing that, then it instantly kills it and no one gets to see it, right? It's the absence of the positive that really drives it. So I guess the other question I have though is a lot of the times the metrics that are useful are not just the metrics about the subject. It's what it reveals about who is giving that score in the first place as well, right? Like if I am in a DAO called Woke DAO and everyone in Woke DAO hates me and doesn't want to give me any sort of credentials, Incel DAO might be like, you're great, you're perfect for us. Like, please come and join us, because if Woke DAO hates you, you're probably right for us too. So I also wonder if we're moving towards that world where, what we're really revealing is not, and this is true in governance too, is not what the best decision is or what the best choice is, but rather the framework itself that was used to determine that.
Absolutely, yeah. The meaning of data is interpreted by the verifier of that data. So information can mean one thing in one community, one thing to Woke DAO and one thing to Incel DAO. Hilarious example. But it is also a reminder that the validity and power of the data that we present, it relies upon the validity of the signature of who said it. And so because we now can bring information from one context to another, we can have verifiable and portable data, we can also explore the universe of, what are all the doors that I can unlock now that I have custody of this particular reputation. The subjectivity of how we interpret data in different contexts is, I think a synecdoche for all of society, right? The fact that you present in a particular way can be powerful in one context and detrimental in another, but our ready ability to decide what that looks like in the communities that we build, in the spaces that we curate, is the core of the power that we get from Web3.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to switch to something that's been on top of my mind. So about a week and a half ago, Vitalik gave this really incredible lecture at Stanford on proposer-builder separation. And there's a lot of takeaways from that, but one of them is that privacy is coming to Ethereum, and there is no way around this. Privacy is a necessary mechanism on-chain, and this is, of course, not really existed before. So in the proposer-builder separation proposal that Vitalik discusses, there's a lot of different possibilities for this, but fundamentally they come down to a block builder that is revealing only the header of a block, proposer that is willing to make a bid for it, and then once that bid has been accepted, then the rest of the block is revealed, and this is done through encryption. So somehow or another, there will be encryption on-chain, and I think this is so fascinating for me because there's been such discussions around privacy for so long, and it's largely been ignored until really the past 2 months. And on the one hand, it's been Tornado Cash, I think, that's really driven that discussion. But on the other hand, it's MEV. And MEV has been this forcing function to now care about encryption on-chain as well. And I think this leads to a bigger question I have, which is there's a lot of assumptions right now that I don't really disagree with, but I'm fascinated by, that the best way to do privacy is through encryption, right? You can still have hashes of any data you want, but then only a certain validator, a signer, is able to decrypt those and actually reveal the underlying data. This, to me, feels a little bit different from the kind of history and discourse on verifiable credentials, where a lot of the focus has been on not having publicly encrypted data that can only be decrypted by certain permission parties, but rather having private data that can be withdrawn as well. And so I wanted to wade into these territories and see, do you have a strong opinion between these camps? Do you feel like they are concordant?
I want them both. I want it all. I think that the on-chain privacy discussion is egregiously tardy, but I'm glad that they've arrived finally. Privacy is not something that you can retrofit once you've made data public. And so the inclusion of it at a core protocol layer for any purpose, I think, is a great benefit to everyone. There's a meaningful difference between obfuscation and air gapping. And I think that's the difference between off-chain data and on-chain privacy. Additionally, encryption is a time-based privacy method. Now I know if encryption breaks, then we have a lot of other problems, but that is still a valid concern for us to have. I also would note that the encryption of certain kinds of data, depending on how it is encrypted, adds another risk surface, right? Who is managing that encryption methodology? Do we trust them? What kinds of failure mechanisms might be, or additional risk surfaces might we be introducing by having a broad, a plurality of providers for that kind of capability? Also, when it comes to verifiable credentials, people have long discussed, well, you could just, encrypt the credential and then present it to a smart contract. But if the contents of the credential are encrypted, but the signature is not, you can leak a significant amount of data simply by taking custody of or interacting with a piece of data that is signed by a certain party. So let's say, to follow Vitalik's example of university diplomas in the form of soul-bound or on-chain tokens, let's say the content of that credential is encrypted, but it is signed by Bennett College, which is a historically black women's university in the United States. If someone's public key attains a mapping with a token that contains data signed by this party, there's a high assurance that that wallet belongs to a black woman. And so the extent of our encryption is really just determined by how we are using it. So I guess in conclusion, very excited about these new developments, but as long as Ethereum is not the only API upon which humanity relies, it doesn't make sense to store data about human beings there, regardless of whether it's encrypted or not.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Evin.
Thank you guys so much. I think, do we have questions? Are we doing? I don't know. Do we have time? Do we have a second for questions or no?
Yes, we're going to move on to Q&A now. So does anybody have any questions, remarks, comments, ramblings perhaps for Evin and David?
Hopefully, Evin.
Yes, what's up?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Awesome discussion presentation, thanks a lot. I want to go back to what you said before, the first thing you said, Evin. So, how to prioritize human experience on the web. Are you having fun or are you tolerating this? This is a key point for me at the moment. So, and I'm going to ask something that I asked some of the previous presenters. So what you talked about is the way I see it, very related to DID, decentralized identity and so forth. How do you see this environment moving forward for the end user? Because some of the things, so of course nobody can see exactly how this is going to work, et cetera, et cetera. How do you guys see it moving forward for the end user? Now, how is this going to be?
So pretty soon, a few months from now, you'll be able to visit app.disco.xyz. You will connect your Ethereum-compatible wallet with one click as you would normally, and you will begin putting together your data backpack. Wallets are for public financial data, and your backpack is for all the rest of the stuff that you need on your adventures from app to app, across chains, Web 2 to Web 3. I think that a simple, friendly, visual interface that allows you to issue, request, disclose, revoke, and manage the data written about you feels like an Apple wallet, feels like a personal settings page, is very skeuomorphic, pulling in trust cues that we know and love from Web 2 and even some of the early cues from Web 3. I think that's what it has to look like. We are reaching a ceiling of fun and utility that we can coordinate around financial assets alone. And so if we are able to build upon the behaviors that folks are starting to become comfortable with, we're able to provide them with a low friction, logical way to use data to unlock the things they were trying to do anyway. I think that's the way forward that makes a lot of sense. I think, sort of to what we were discussing earlier, providing tools that remove friction from the activities that you're already participating in is a pretty surefire way to appeal to users, rather than inviting them to come along with you on some technical conjecture that may or may not have value to their lives. Any other thoughts there, David?
Oh, do I have to answer this too? Okay. Yeah, I think one premise we've had a lot in crypto and Web3 is that financial incentives are the ultimate incentives. And this is a kind of fascinating conclusion to draw. Certainly for the people who are financially incentivized, there's a lot of money there, and so it makes sense to go after that. But it's a really fascinating conclusion to draw when you look at Web 2, and Web 2 is based on people giving up financial incentives in order to have social incentives, right? Like we have 10 years of data just showing that people really, really want social capital. They really, really want social incentives. So I think like a lot of thinking about data portability and sovereignty, yeah, the financial aspect is huge. If you can actually monetize off your own data instead of Facebook doing it, that's gigantic. But fundamentally on the internet, people really care about social capital and convenience. And so I do think, like why will I never give up Spotify? It's because its algorithms are so good to recommend me content. The real unlock is if I am comfortable revealing more data that can improve the kind of recommendations that I can get as well and improve my own experience in finding other people I care about and finding projects I care about. And I really think it's the social connection layer that actually will be the huge, huge unlock for data portability.
Totally agree. Let us flex with our data before we financialize our data.
Am I allowed to ask you the 5 incentives?
Immediately, yes.
Okay, yeah. So Evin was telling me right before the talk that there's 5. It's incentives all the way down, and there's 5 types.
So I think a lot about reasons that people will use applications or will explore new technologies. And generally, I think that there are 5 types of incentives that come to the fore. Does this tool help you get paid, get laid, flex, save time, or is it an obligation that you have to? And so if there are more than one of these particular incentives that your application delivers to your users, then I think that you are on the right path.
And then the 6th one, masochism, believing that pain is gain, I would add as well. Any other questions?
So I'm quite curious when it comes to data bias. For example, we talk about private data or personal data being stored on chain and immutability being a value add. But I actually think immutability is highly problematic when we think about mutable beings and the schemas that have pervaded Web 2 that were highly immutable, from like relational databases to storing gender on the CRM. That leads perpetually to algorithmic biases. And now you have a space where in decentralization, there's even no accountability. It could spread like a virus if we allow bias to permeate. So I'm actually quite curious, how does Disco in its backpack schema address that? Is it something you're thinking about?
I agree 1,000,000%. I think that data that describes us as human beings has no place in a public immutable ledger. The core of individualism is our ability to change and evolve as people. Our identities are not fixed and public and permanent, and so therefore the metadata that describes us needs to be similarly flexible. In the same way that we do in real life, we need the ability to have data that describes the addition of new traits and qualities to our person, and we need the ability to jettison and remove that which no longer serves us. I think the same flexibility is required we must demand it of our data storage solutions as well. We need the ability to move our data from one place to another if that storage no longer serves us. And so to your point about bias, I think that's largely incumbent upon the verifiers of data to be self-aware. Yeah. So the challenge there, of course, is that if you are curating a community and you are giving out privileges and capabilities based on the data that people present, that is inherently based on trust in the signatures of the data that's born, trust in the curation of the data that's presented, trust in the interpretation of that data. But if we are able to logically centralize data around ourselves, physically decentralize where it lives, and be the foremost expert on our own experience, I think that we're going to be able to peel away, or at least be more aware of the systems of bias that take an opinion on how that's presented. Additionally, the algorithms that interpret data are a direct reflection of the data upon which they were trained. They are a direct reflection upon the individuals who curated and wrote them. And so, as David was saying, it's incentives all the way down. And so we as builders have an obligation to question what are our incentives when we create the tools in this stack.
Well, Evin, David, I have to say that was an excellent fireside chat. It certainly leaves a lot of creative and enticing and enlightening things to ponder about this week. Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Thank you guys so much for having us. We'll see you in the metaverse.